I'm Bob Wayland. I'm president of the EPA Alumni Association, and I want to thank everybody for your flexibility as we juggle our schedule a little bit. I got a text from Governor Whitman a short time before we started saying that she had been invited to appear on Hardball, and she didn't want to turn them down unless we absolutely insisted on it. And fortunately, everybody here was on their best behavior, and we have everyone in their seats. We've reversed the order of the program that we had planned so that we can get the governor on. And here comes Stan right on cue. Stan Myberg, welcome. We have a number of distinguished people here tonight, and I probably don't have time to note all of them, but Secretary Ben Grumbles, Secretary of the Environment for Maryland is here. Bob Perciasepi, former Deputy Administrator, is here. Linda Fisher, former Deputy Administrator. Jack Moore, former Deputy Administrator. So we have a real who's who of EPA leadership, past and present, here tonight. Our speaker is known to most of you, I think. Christie Whitman was just out of college when she heard the call to public service. She joined the Nixon administration's Office of Economic Opportunity when she was just in her 20s. OEO was headed by a rising star in Congress who'd first been elected at age 30, Donald Rumsfeld. At OEO, Ms. Whitman had the opportunity to work with another Rumsfeld hire, Dick Cheney. During this period, our speaker probably learned firsthand the adage, if you want to be loved in D.C., get a dog. After later running the Washington office of the state of New York, Governor Whitman returned to New Jersey, elected and chaired the Somerset County Board of Freeholders. Governor Tom Kean, whom some of us remember, and I lost the mic, there we go, whom some of us remember from his service on the National Wetlands Policy Forum, appointed Ms. Whitman to the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities. Christine Todd Whitman became New Jersey's first woman governor when she defeated incumbent James Florio in 1993. She was reelected in 1997. She resigned to accept George W. Bush's offer to become EPA's administrator. Some may remember that her former Office of Economic Opportunity colleagues, Mr. Cheney and Rumsfeld, also assumed senior positions in the administration. Perhaps contemplating what would lie ahead for the president-elect, Governor Whitman gave him a puppy from the litter her Scottish Terrier Coors had recently had. Barney, as President Bush named the dog, became and remained the most popular member of the administration. As you see from this photo, this is not the first time I've introduced Governor Whitman. This occasion was when she graciously accepted our invitation for her to speak at the open house when my former Office of Wetlands, Oceans, and Watersheds moved to the new headquarters complex. Before that, in the earliest days of her tenure, she and colleagues, Susan Mulvaney and maybe Jessica among them, I don't remember clearly, came to our outpost in the Fairchild building to welcome just 150 EPA employees who were sandwiched between the Southwest Freeway and the CSX railroad tracks. It was an extremely gracious gesture, and we really appreciated it. Governor Whitman embraced the watershed approach to improving water quality, and with her AA, Tracy Meehan, who's also here tonight, advanced a trading initiative to bring market forces to bear on cleaning rivers, lakes, streams, and coastal waters. Jeff Homestead, who paid his registration, Jeff Homestead is here as well, and his air office developed a rule that reduced off-road vehicle diesel emissions by 95%, which Administrator Whitman issued. And Marianne Horenko was going to be here tonight, and I don't see her yet, but she and Governor Whitman worked on brownfields legislation, which gave the agency more tools to clean up abandoned, contaminated industrial sites and repurpose them for productive uses. Tom Voltaggio, who was Hazardous Waste Director, or maybe it was DRA at the time, I lose track, speaks glowingly of working closely with Governor Whitman in the aftermath of the September 11th attacks on the World Trade Center. After 3 exciting years at EPA, Governor Whitman tendered her resignation. And after leaving the agency, she wrote a book urging her party to take a more centrist path and reject litmus test politics. She created a political action committee with the same aim. She serves on the board of the American Security Project heads the Whitman Strategy Group, most of whose employees are here tonight, and serves on corporate boards. She served on the board of Americans Elect, which sought to replace the current primary system with a direct online nomination process. Now, after the last few months, who doesn't think that's a good idea?
Yes, this is
She
David
testified
Dominic.
with former administrators Thomas, Ruckelshaus, and Riley before James Inhofe's Senate Environment Committee in favor of policies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. She's also commented on this year's presidential campaign. Since the association is a nonpartisan group, I'll leave it to her whether to share any of her insights on this topic that's dominated the news for the last many months and will surely continue to do so even tonight on Hardball.
Richard.
So please join me in giving a warm welcome to EPA's Ninth Administrator, Christie Whitman.
Thanks, Bob, very much. And I want to just start by thanking all of you, not just for being flexible. I appreciate that. I'm not sure after the interview, maybe I won't quite so much. It might have been nice to have a good excuse, but in any event, but no, for your service. I really do thank you for the dedication that you've given to this country through your service at EPA. It's one of the most underrated agencies that I think I know. Of course, now it's not so underrated, which we might do better if it were. It's sort of the center of a bullseye, which is a bit of a problem. And I don't envy any of them that are there now trying to weave their way through this toxic political environment that we have. But it was a privilege and a pleasure to be able to serve there and to work with many of you who are here and many of you who went before. So working on your legacy and what you've left behind. I was asked to talk a little bit about what surprised me when I got to the agency because, as a governor, I had dealt with environmental issues and I dealt with the EPA. But I did not appreciate, I have to say, how constrained EPA is by the enabling legislation. And it's a message that I try to get to people as often as I can, that when they blame the agency for taking action on something, particularly the air issues, when we talk about carbon, they have to. There are certain regulations that require that they take on certain things in a specific time period, and they don't have a choice. And they don't have the ability to be as flexible as many people would like to be. I look at the Clean Power Plan, and one of the things I continuously say is I think the agency went as far as it possibly could in providing some flexibility within that plan. You may not like it, you may argue over how it was structured and whether the particular subset they used, a 111D, is the right one. But as far as recognizing the differences that different states face in trying to meet those standards, I think they went as far as they could go. And yet constantly you hear, my judge and everybody who was with me will say that the judge of whether I was doing well or not was when we were being sued by both sides. Because it didn't matter. You're going to get sued. And that's the other thing I try to explain to people. It's very hard when you're in a regulatory agency. Every time you promulgate a regulation, you're telling people to change behavior or spend a lot of money for an issue they might not think is important. And that's a very hard message to get across to people. But when we talk about climate change, because it is one of the biggest issues that we face in this country, in the world today, I happen to think, and I've said for quite a while, that I thought water was the number one, quantity and quality of water was the number one environmental issue of the 21st century, and that's inexorably linked to climate change. And the need to take on this issue to me is paramount. But I've almost given up talking about that now. I don't talk in terms of climate change. I talk in terms of clean air. I don't care why people do the right thing. I just want them to do the right thing. And to me, when you talk about clean air, it's much more directly relevant to the public. When you talk about a changing climate, they're getting it now. Every time we see another storm, another flood, another drought, while no credible scientist will say that this particular storm, flood, drought, earthquake, whatever is due to climate change, they will say, hey, what you can expect from climate change is increasing frequency and severity of these kinds of outbreaks. But when you talk about it from a clean air point of view, and one of the statistics that I use now a lot is the data from 2013, which is the most recent data that we have, that around the world, some 5.5 million people died from diseases related to dirty air. In this country, it was 91,000 people, and that's almost 3 times as many people as were killed in car crashes in 2013. And yet, when you think of the amount of time and effort we spend on making our roads safer and our cars safer, and yet we don't even talk about clean air. It's still the #1 cause of children's missed school days because of asthma. We don't know what causes asthma. We know it can trigger an attack or exacerbate it. And I think where we've always tried to adhere to the science and recognize, for instance, it is global warming ultimately that is causing the ice caps, the ice sheets to melt. The difference and the impact in different places is not going to be consistent. And so that gives the naysayers a big opening when you have somebody like Jim Inhofe, and I won't characterize him any further than that, taking a snowball to the floor of the Senate and throwing it at somebody, but tell me about this global warming. You want to say, first of all, that's conduct unbecoming a senator, I would have thought. But the fact that he did it, you have to understand how that played into the hands. The cold winter, when we have cold winters, they say, well, tell me about this global warming. So I talk about climate change. But again, as I said, I've morphed from even talking about climate change to trying to get people to understand this is about clean air. Don't you just want clean air? Wouldn't it be nice if we had clean air? And that's where people respond. That's where they say yes. And oh, by the way, guess what? What's in the air comes down. And that gets into the water supply. And so it affects our water. Different from what we're seeing in Flint. And that's another issue of major import. And we're going to see that all around the country. We already are. But it's still something with which people can relate. And I do think if you look in this country, probably true in most countries, but in this country more than anything else, we first of all respond very much to price points, but we also respond to crisis. Nobody does better than the Americans when it comes to a crisis. Flint is a crisis, and it's time to use that opportunity to say we need to do something about our water overall. Because as the various government localities are now starting to take a look at what their infrastructure looks like, they're seeing the same thing. What's going to be interesting is to see who pays the price on this, because the lawyers are ready. And I know there are a lot of lawyers in this room, and God bless you. I think it's wonderful. But the trial lawyers are ready, and they've already started in cities like Newark, which the state took over. The question is, who do you sue? Do you sue Newark? Do you sue the state? Because they've taken over the schools. How much is that tab going to be? Who's going to pay for it? And that's even before you get to trying to improve the infrastructure, trying to make it all work. Those kinds of challenges that EPA and those working in the environment face every day are so complicated and so difficult that finding the right language is the real challenge to make people understand how it makes a difference to them and in their lives. And that's why I applaud so many of you who worked so hard and so long in trying to do that. And also just trying to address those issues and say, what is safe? It's hard when you get banged around when something that you thought was the newest, best thing to do turns out, in fact, not to have been so great. I mean, asbestos was a lifesaver in a lot of places. Asbestos was a great thing. It was only after a long period of time that we discovered that, no, in fact, we have to be very careful with it, how it's handled, and what kind of asbestos it is. There are all these kinds of issues that keep bubbling up because science is not exact. Scientists are always finding new challenges. They're always finding new things that they didn't know before. And I've talked to some very intelligent people that will say that, well, science evolution is a theory. So, well, that's kind of what science usually is. It's based on theories, but they're always finding other things that are proving it more and more. So when do you start to believe? I like some of the naysayers on climate change and say, I'm not a scientist, so I don't believe them, which they don't seem to have that problem. They're not doctors, most of them, but they seem to be able to find all sorts of knowledge about how they can regulate people's medical treatment and what they can and can't get. So their consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds, and we don't accuse any of those in the position to make decisions of having small minds. We don't want to do that. But it's been to me, environmental protection is one of the most important building blocks to providing a good quality of life for our citizens. And that's the whole range of it, from protecting open space to letting Mother Nature do what she does best, cleaning water, things like that. Smart growth, which is part of that will help improve the environment, to get us to clean air and clean water. One of the things that I always remind people when they look with despair and say, oh gosh, how terrible this political season is, and how do we get here, how terrible it all is. And I want to say, well, just remember, it's the people in a democracy that make the difference. The EPA was started in 1970, not because Congress suddenly woke up one day and said, gee, we have nothing else to do. We've got cities that are burning down with race riots. We've got college campuses that are burning up because of anti-Vietnam race riots. We've got the women's movement. We have nothing better to do. Let's go on, take on the environment. It wasn't that. It was because the American people stood up and say, we're tired of dirty air. We're tired of watching the land turn into a garbage dump. We don't like the fact that rivers spontaneously combust. It's just not a good thing. And then Rachel Carson wrote The Silent Spring, and that's what got a Republican president to work with a Democrat Congress to give us the laws that now protect us. And the other fight that I think all of us have shared in for so long is this idea that somehow the environment is a zero-sum game. That it's impossible to have a clean and green environment and a healthy, thriving economy. Well, from 1985 to 2012, our economy was growing. Our economy was doing all right. We increased our population by over 25%. We increased our electricity use, our power use, by over 35%. And our GDP more than doubled in real dollars, and yet we reduced the 6 criteria pollutants by over 67%. So if anybody ever says, we know that this is not a zero-sum game, we know if done right, we can have a thriving and growing economy and a clean and green environment. And again, it's up to everybody who has been part of EPA, who is currently there now, and who cares about these issues going forward, to continue to remind people of that, because the average person doesn't know it. That's something that's a inside baseball statistic, but once they hear it, then they start to think, okay, we can do this. There are smart ways to reduce our carbon emissions. Smart ways that are not going to crater the economy. That can create jobs. There are smart ways of dealing with water quality, and ways that are not going to force people to lose their homes or lose their water purveyors. But we have got to be able to address that. The problem the agency has is how restricted it is because of the enabling legislation, the requirements, the inability to be as creative as I know many of you wanted to be and have wanted to be. Every time you do that, you know you get hauled into court. And usually that's by the environmentalists when you're trying to be a little bit creative, because they think you're giving big business a freebie. And it takes patience, it takes dedication, it takes commitment. And that's what everybody, I believe, who's worked at that agency have had. And I just want to say again, I want to thank you for having been willing to make that commitment. And it's been a real privilege for me to have been part of it. Tough, didn't always like it, wasn't always happy, but that wasn't what the job was supposed to be. But it was a privilege of working with people who were dedicated and smart and caring more than anything else. With that, I'll stop because I'd really like to do Q&A. I think that's much more interesting than just going on and talking. I don't care, I'll stand. That's fine.
So do we have some questions?
On anything.
Gordon Bender.
Could you say a little bit more about the language? Say a little bit more about the language. I mean, clean air, yes, we get it, but do people make the connection between carbon and clean air when you speak to different audiences?
You have to explain it to them. But as my husband said after I came back from the first few months at EPA, I could ruin any dinner party because I'd tell them, see how beautiful that sunset is? Guess what? That's PM 2.5. That's pollution. Or don't eat the strawberries or the grapes because they put nasty things in the ground to protect the bugs. It was not a happy time. But yeah, they do if you explain it to them. And frankly, that is an analogy I often use. That, when you look at that sunset, I also say to them, when you look at the sunset, you're looking at pollutants, which they kind of like a beautiful sunset. The other thing when people say, but everything's so clean, I said, when was the last time you went outside after a rain and wiped anything down and didn't come away with a dirty cloth? And then they say, oh yeah, Yeah, no, I know. My car gets dirty. If you have a porch or anything outside, that's dirty. And then they start to make the connection. It's not always easy, and Lord knows I haven't found all the right language to use. I keep trying out different things. I'm sure it's the focus groups come up with even more.
Has joined.
But the important thing is to try to relate it to real time, real life experiences. And that's why I said, as much as anything, I moved away. I mean, I do talk about climate change, but I always try to then relate it to clean air and morph into clean air, because that's something they can really get and say, guess what? That problem, you can solve that problem with climate change, with reducing those pollutants, as well as a host of other things, though, by the way.
And Fran have microphones to give to people who would like to ask a question.
You talked about the bullseye on the agency's back. I was shocked last fall when I was meeting with a Tea Party member who looked me in the eye and asked me if I thought that EPA should be abolished. What do you think the EPA can do or should do to repair its relationship with the Congress?
That's a toughie. A lot's going to depend on how this election cycle turns out. That's going to change attitudes depending on who's elected. You have one candidate who is going to abolish the agency, and another one who is fairly cognizant of the issues that we face, and is willing to work with the agency. And that's going to depend on what kind of coattails they have, what happens in the Congress, whether Republicans keep control. There are not a lot, but there are a significant number of Republicans who actually do believe in climate change and do believe that we can do something to address the issue, but they're afraid to come out, as it were. We need to provide a little bit more of the backing for them. We need to let them know that we're there. We can give them the statistics they need. We can give them the backup data that they need, how to translate this into their constituents, why it makes a difference, and how important it is. And the agency needs to do that. Unfortunately, we've seen it every time. At the end of every administration, you push out all the ugly babies and rules. And so EPA gets left with a lot of ugly babies. And with the poisonous attitude we have on the Hill now, that anything that's coming from Democrats is bad and vice versa, it's very hard to get over that. So to the degree that the agency can keep its head down for now is the best way to go. Because what they're going to do if they don't, you can't do away with the agency. There happen to be things called laws and statute that make that a little difficult. But they can starve the agency to death, which they have done in the past, and they're doing quite a good job of it right now. And that then gets back to the public. You have to get the public to finally decide that this is important. We don't want to lose this agency. This is what has given us cleaner air and less polluted water. We've seen we could do it. We've seen we could do it and increase our economic output. So it's getting back to the public. But to me, that's the whole issue surrounding where we are today in our political process, is people just haven't been voting. They don't vote in primaries. They haven't been voting until this cycle. Now they're turning out, but they didn't. We kind of left it to somebody else would do it. We get complacent in a democracy, especially one that's been as successful and as long-lived as ours has been. But you've got to be careful of that.
We have the ability to take questions from the phones. I don't think we have one right now, but I'll just make that a prompt to people who called in or who are watching the video. And in the meantime, we can take another question here.
I'm back.
Scott Bush, the water program that had done work on climate change at CSIS and other places. Senator Moynihan was a great senator with a wonderful sense of humor. And he has said that you're entitled to your own opinions,
right,
but not your own facts. And it seems that with environmental policy, the facts get in way of bringing consensus together.
Mm-hmm.
The Congress on either side has their own facts. People in the community, business and other communities have their own facts. From your experience, is there a way what would you suggest how we can get the people to understand better the facts involved and then focus on the policy issues as opposed to putting it vice versa?
Well, it's a chicken and egg because, quite frankly, until we get over looking at every single issue through the partisan political prism and look at it through the policy prism, it's pretty tough to get them to accept what the facts are. Because every issue now is it's going to get me another vote in my caucus or another percentage on my reelect. And I would argue again, it's because we, the people, haven't been making enough noise, saying this just isn't acceptable. That's one thing I've got to give both Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. Is if nothing else, they have reminded people that the way to make changes through the ballot box, that they need to be involved. Trying to get people to accept facts. When you have 97% of scientists who are saying climate change is real and man has a role to play in it, and they still won't believe it, I don't know how you get around that one. Again, it has to come back to their constituents saying, hey, no, we don't think you're in the right place. I mean, we haven't had an energy policy in decades in this country, and that's all interrelated with air quality and everything else. And so we need to stand up and say and ask our candidates, how do you think we're going to meet our electricity demands? If it's a 24% increase in electricity demand by 2040, how are we going to get there? What kind of green power is acceptable? What kind of clean power will you go for? What can we do to get to the end of the day? But when facts are as stark as they are, and still people are able to delude themselves into not believing them, it's pretty hard to see how you get around. So what you have to do is what you do with most of these kinds of issues that are very contentious. You recognize there are parts of each side that you're just never going to get together, and find those ones in the middle with whom you can work. That's why I argue with groups such as No Labels is trying to find its way through that. There are up to 92 members now, Republicans and Democrats in the House, who've accepted and signed on to their resolution. And those resolutions call for a bipartisan approach to government, as well as some very specifics within that as far as addressing the budget and the challenges we face with Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, the entitlement programs. And they're willing to work on other issues as well, but they've got to get, crazily enough, they've got to get Republicans and Democrats comfortable with the fact that they can work with one another. The other side isn't the enemy. And that's unfortunately taking baby steps right now. But it's happening.
Good evening. I'm wondering, everybody in this room, of course, is very concerned about the environment and environmental issues, but on public polls, the general public is not interested in the environment. What can we do to make it more relevant and a higher priority for the American people, besides jobs and security and all those other things?
I don't think it's not important to the American people. It's just what's more important is am I going to have a job next week? Am I going to have a roof over my head? Can I afford to send my kids to camp or get them what they want? If you ask them, if you dig down a little bit deeper and put environment on a list, then it pops up much higher if it's listed. If you give them an open-ended, what are your top 10 issues? They tend to focus on the issues where they feel they might have some impact. And what you have to do is start explaining to them. It's what we tried to do when we entered into that. We had the tentative pilot program that we did with meteorologists, trying to educate people to the fact on water when we were dealing with watersheds, that people lived in a watershed. A lot of people thought, well, I don't live anywhere near a stream, so what difference does it make if I dump the oil from my car on the driveway? Big deal. Or if I put a lot of fertilizer on the lawn, what's it going to do? And when we looked, we found that the time when people pay the most attention when watching the news is during the weather, because it's got neat maps and it shows you all sorts of things happening. But it also means, can you have the picnic tomorrow? Or, do you need to wear a raincoat? So they're really paying attention then. So what we tried and ran a pilot program. Tracy, how long did that go for? Do you remember? Yeah, it ran on the Weather Channel. We were trying to get them to say, okay, now's the time when you say there's going to be a big weather event, there's a lot of rain coming, tell people that this is not a good time probably to fertilize your lawn or to put down pesticides, because it's all going to wash away and it's going to end up in this storm drain down the road from you. And that feeds into a stream that ends up in the ocean. And it's why you have, I'm sure the statistic is still valid, every 8 months as much oil deposited along the coastline of the United States from non-source point pollution as was released during the Exxon Valdez. That, of course, now is an old statistic because nobody knows what the Exxon Valdez was. They're all Deepwater Horizon, and I'm not sure we were quite at Deepwater Horizon, which is good, fortunately. But, you have to sort of break it down into those kinds of events with which people can relate, or something that really grabs them. You can say, oh, by the way, you're also wasting money if you do it now, if you over. But it's over fertilizing, putting too much pesticide on too, and that's one of the issues that you have with farmers, as they have some left over. It's not a huge amount, but enough to make a difference, and they say, okay, I'm just going to put it on the field, even though they don't need to put that much on, and that's when you start to run into trouble.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. With all due respect, I would like to disagree with you that
Sure.
the public is
You're not
the
alone,
problem.
by the way.
Okay, no, but respectfully, I don't think it's really reasonable at this point to expect the public to be able to know enough to respond. What we've had here, I speak as a scientist who was on the IPCC. Science is under attack. And when you stand up as a scientist and talk about public health impact of fossil fuels, you've got such a well-developed denial industry where they get other scientists to work as a form of public relations, that the public is very confused, and the generation of confusion and doubt is in fact what these big PR agencies are paid to do. As long as we can get one hand versus the other hand, people will say, well, we don't know anything, we've got uncertainty. Since we have uncertainty, let's do nothing. When in fact doing nothing, as you know, is a continuation of old policies. So I'm wondering whether you would think something like a revival of the Office of Technology Assessment for Congress might be appropriate. And I think the CBO, generally, the Congressional Budget Office, has been regarded as a success, although there's always mixed views. But in fact, it's maintained a pretty nonpartisan view as a source of information about economic analysis. Administrations don't always like it, nor does Congress, but it plays to the middle. And what's missing for science right now is a credible institution of that sort that has the mandate and, frankly, the money to provide that kind of insight and wisdom. And so without it, you're left with this media soundbite of science, one against another. And of course, the public is confused. And when it comes to things like the Weather Channel, that was a brilliant trial. Mexico City, they have daily reports about whether or not your child can go out and play with asthma, okay? And they've got a serious problem, of course. Some cities in the United States have played around with this. It might be the kind of thing that would work because there's a science behind this. We know about asthma and fine particulates and SOx and NOx and ozone and how those can exacerbate it. And I'm wondering whether, again, a more credible institution is needed. Of course, calling for a new institution now is probably not very realistic either, but it might be if someone of your standing were to say, look, we need credible, independent evaluations, that might give some impetus to this idea. Just want to throw it out.
Sure. Well, first of all, I don't disagree with you. When I talk about I blame people for the Congress we have and the kinds of people we have because they haven't been voting. But when I said that scientists disagree and that the people you can always find somebody who's an outlier. And so it does confuse people when it's not your major issue, when you are not the one that doesn't consume you every day, you're not following it every day, then clearly you can get easily confused when you have a scientist that'll say, yes, it's happening, and no, it's not happening, and humans cause it, humans have a role to play, humans have nothing to do with it. It does get confusing if this isn't what you focus on every day, day in and day out. And so I don't disagree with you to getting a credible, but what will they accept as credible? As far as, and I'm talking about the political people. I mean, if you could get the news media to step up and start to do more as far as promoting some of these things, because Lord knows they are not, they don't step back from taking positions just by what they put on in their tweets and their blogs and what they put on when up on the television or on the radio when they're talking. They can bring up issues. They can start talking about something like this. But I don't think that's a bad idea at all. I always thought that our science advisory boards were pretty much that way. Yes, we did put a whole lot of people together because that's the way you got things done. It was the diesel rule happened because we sat down the NRDC along with the engine makers, along with OMB, and our people and whacked out that rule. So we do need to have the public have more confidence in what they're hearing, and what the vehicle is that will give them that kind of confidence. I'm not sure. If they don't have their political representatives, who are the ones particularly here in Washington, because the press is here, the press is lazy, they'll take what they are fed from here. And until we get those people to promote that kind of thing and to say this is what we need, or this is a credible organization, I'm going to listen to this. This is where I'm going to get my facts as I move forward. It's going to be a lot harder to get there. Again, a lot will depend, I think, on what happens in this election cycle.
Let me just add that the budget and the staffing for science reporting at the New York Times, the Washington Post, is the lowest it's ever been.
Sure.
Across the board. NPR as well, Center for Public Integrity, has just let go one of their premier science reporters. So it goes with the equation. We've got political science, but we don't have real science reporting at this time.
I think we have time for one or two more questions or short
back there.
Has joined.
Had your hand up back there? Yeah.
Hi. Thank you. I'm so glad you're here, and it's a very, very great talk. I wanted to mention one thing in my own personal experience. I retired from EPA 3 years ago after almost 40 years at EPA, and very proud of what I'd done, thinking that what I did made a lasting difference to the environment and public health and people's lives. I almost immediately shifted to local government at that point, and I live in Washington, D.C., which is a state and local government at the same time, and discovered what I thought was great, they did not think was so great. And so after working with them for a few years, I've now concluded the cutting edge failure of EPA is not in setting the standards, not in communicating even the risk and of all that, which we've been talking about here, but in implementation. In general, we're very poor implementers. We have a headquarters region environment in a matrix management type approach, and we sit here not really giving enough respect to the regions to actually implement the programs. And immediately after something that's very hot, like lead, for instance, lead in drinking water, it was very hot. I thought we did a remarkable job. Lo and behold, 10, 15 years later, we have something like Flint, Michigan coming up. So my question really is, a question to everybody, is EPA is a poor implementer. Is there some way, and implementer means the real success, the outcome of why you're setting the standards, not writing regulations, but actually improving public health or coming up with clean water and drinking water. That's why we're there, but we do a very poor job of measuring it. So an orientation by EPA to implement what we've already done over 30 to 35 years seems a lot more valuable. So I just preached a lot, and I apologize.
No, that's fine. And it's true. One of the biggest challenges that I think the agency and the regions face is their relationship with the states and local governments. You have to give them respect, you have to depend on them, you have to get them to buy in, and you have to work with them. And it becomes a challenge at times, but in general, I think a lot of the regions do have pretty good relationship, but I would challenge everyone here who has had the experience of working at EPA to get involved in either in your municipality or your state, and start to work with people and to educate them about what EPA does do and what it does bring and the advantage and what it does for human health, what it does for making people's lives healthier, better quality of life. Those are all important, and everybody sitting here in this room and all the others who have retired or those who are at the agency today have the ability to influence that. We should never think that we don't have that kind of ability, and it's by talking about it with the people who are on the ground, who are going to be working very directly with those who are impacted, and understanding. I mean, one of the things that we've got to remember is that what looks right in a lab doesn't necessarily translate in the real world. And I know we went through the Hudson, getting the cleanup standards done and taking that dredging and desalination. What looked right, dewatering, when it looked right initially, when we started to do it, and I put in a proviso that the environmentalists hated that said we were going to start it and then we were going to take a look and make sure it worked. Because it looked like it would work in the lab. Was it really going to work in the real world? And we found out, in fact, we were at some points creating more pollution than we'd cleaned up. and we had to revise slightly and redo it. Didn't mean we stopped, didn't mean we didn't do it. It meant you've got to be willing to admit if there is a mistake, and you've got to be willing to understand that implementing things is very different than just coming up with what science tells you is the right thing. Scientists may tell you this is the thing to do, and when you try to apply it to the real world, there's a big disconnect. And so it's hard because you're being told this is what's right, this is the safety standard, so you got to figure out how do you implement this in a way that makes it real. The nutrient trading program on water quality was another way to do that, is to say, look, we recognize if you're downstream from a cattle ranch and your utility has a real problem and they're going to have to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to clean up to the standard that they have to reach, but they can spend maybe a couple of thousand with a rancher to help him put in a water system and refence for his cattle, and your water quality is the same where you need it to be clean, that makes some sense. But you have to take that look and have to see. Okay, thank you all very much.